Welcome to our Forvm Romanvm meeting. I'm sorry that we don't have the full audience since we're in the middle of the holiday week, so many people are out somewhere. And I have a special greeting and apology to deliver from our Caesar, our honorary president, Professor Sima Avramovic, who is absent this evening, although he generally tries to make it to every appointment because he just flew to the Vatican this morning. He's been appointed ambassador there, and they're having a welcome dinner at our Italian embassy there right now. So he really can't join us, but he sends his greetings. So our guest for tonight is Coleman Dennehy, a professor at the University College Dublin. I'll just ask everyone who's not speaking to turn off their microphones, and I'll mute whom I see. So Professor Dennehy is teaching at the University College Dublin. He is a professor of legal history, interested mostly, unless I'm mistaken, in parliamentary history on one side and criminology and criminal law on the other, and mostly in the modern period, 17th, 18th century. He's written and edited some interesting books that might interest some of you if you like the lecture tonight, and I'm hoping that you will. I'm expecting that you will. Coleman and I first met in 2015, I think, at the conference of the International Commission for the History of Parliamentary and Representative Institutions in London, and he was the soul of the conference, and we've been seeing each other more or less regularly on those conferences since, and now we only see each other this way. But I'm very happy that we could have you to give a lecture at the forum, at least in this online form, and I hope that sometime in the future we will also have you live in Belgrade and show you around a little. So Coleman, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina, and thank you very much for the invite. And indeed, I must agree with you that being able to do it in person would be a far better way of doing things. But needs must. Aside from that, and the sort of artificially long hair, it's one of the many things that we have to put up with. And I don't think it's ever been the case where apologies have been presented to me before a lecture for somebody missing it, where the only thing coming between the potential audience member and my lecture is responsibilities in dealing with God's representative on earth. So I don't think I can complain too much about that particular one. But I'm very honored to be asked to be invited to speak. I'm very privileged for that, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk primarily about English law as it's exercised in Ireland across the period. I'll be very curious to hear back from people who suffer through my lecture to see if there's kind of comparative remarks that can be made. I know sometimes we artificially try to find comparisons in every country around the world when we compare them to our own and whatever else, but it always strikes me that places like the South European, in the Balkan area, having a sort of a very interesting sort of history with regards to empire and alternative sort of language and religion and imperial and colonial experiences might be very interesting. It was it's always had an interest for me, because one of the few remnants of my grandaunt's time abroad was actually, Nina, I think I showed this to you, is actually a book that I have dated. It says Papa with Love from Ida, Christmas 1921, which was almost exactly the time that Ireland was negotiating a treaty to move Ireland outside of the orbit of the British Empire and to become the Irish Free State. And it's a book of the national proverbs of Serbia. And she actually traveled in her late teenage and early 20 years around Europe quite a bit before World War I. Family legend has it that she was on the last train out of Germany in August 1914, just before that massive war. And this book has sat on my bookshelves, and the last few days I've sort of went through it furiously, looking for some sort of a legal proverb that I could start the lecture with, but there was none that I could find useful. So it may be the case that the best ones, in fact, aren't in this book, but it makes a very, very interesting point to start with, I think. So what I'm going to try to do today, this evening, is to take a long look at Ireland's kind of colonial or imperial experience of being part of England's empire, later Britain's empire, and to see where it fits in and how the law helped to shape that experience, and whether it gave Ireland certain advantages than others did in their imperial experiences, or whether it was set up purposely with a view, whether there's a long-term plan for colony and empire, or whether it happens just in a sort of a happenstance sort of a way of people moving, just falling from one critical event to the other over the centuries. So it's a sort of a long whistle-stop tour. I'm not going to be going in heavy detail on anything in particular. I'm presuming that most of the audience probably doesn't have an intimate knowledge of Irish history in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, or of Irish legal history for that matter. So I'm not giving a sort of a dummy's guide version, but we will go in insightfully in a certain amount of areas, but I won't be going too heavily across the whole period, because I only have, I believe, about 40 minutes and there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. If this works now, this is usually the point where things don't. See the PowerPoint coming up appropriately as it is.
Yes, it works. It works.
And still be able to hear me. Is that okay? Is it clear? And I'm being heard at the same time?
Yes.
So, okay, great. Ireland, very much in the early Middle Ages and into the higher Middle Ages, is, even though it's on the edge of Europe, it very much is a part of the European experience in the Middle Ages. And the high Middle Ages, I suppose, came knocking on Ireland's door in the reign of the English King Henry II in the middle. And the first hugely important constitutional document that comes up before us is called the Bull Laudabiliter in the year 1155. This was a papal bull that gave permission and perhaps even encouragement to Henry II, the Anglo-Norman King of England. He also held large amounts of French territories as well, to give him permission to invade and to govern Ireland for the purposes of reforming the Irish Church. As happened often with countries very much out on the edge or the periphery of Europe, the Irish Church had, in the kind of 10th and the 11th and the early 12th century, had at times had a sort of an existence that wasn't quite in as close a communion with Rome as places like Germany or France or Spain would have been. Now, as it happens, a number of important church synods are held in the years after 1155, which effectively did bring Ireland very much into a very close observance of church norms in the 12th century. But nevertheless, this Bull Laudabiliter was this official kind of document, and it's one of some importance later on as well, because it's essentially one of the ways by which Anglo-Norman, by which we later mean English, sovereignty over Ireland rests, that it's an international document and that it's justifiable for those reasons. And later on, we do see the law of conquest coming into play as well. The invasion of 1169, which came at the request of a dispossessed Irish regional king from the southeast of the country, who had been essentially thrown out of his kingdom. It all goes back, if you read on it, particularly to an argument over a woman, as it happens, and he lost out and he becomes a refugee in England, and he looks for assistance in getting his territories back into his own ownership. Henry II initially is not particularly interested. It's not his initial aim to invade Ireland, but some of his supporters are given permission to do so. So what happens as almost as a private enterprise, as often happens with colonies, you see this in sub-Saharan Africa in the 19th century, where individuals sometimes go off on what on effect is a sort of a solo run, and they're then in danger of setting up for themselves in Ireland as such. And a few years later, in 1172, Henry II himself arrives and formally takes possession of Ireland. Ostensibly, it's the whole island of Ireland, but obviously, it's a difficult project to realise. And thus, from this year onwards, 1172, based on the justification provided by the Bull Laudabiliter, Ireland effectively comes into the English orbit, or into the Anglo-Norman orbit from this time. Initially, it's set up as a lordship, and the idea is that Henry's got several two sons that are important in this story. Richard, who's the elder son, he becomes known in English history as Richard the Lionheart, and the younger king, John. If you're interested in English medieval history and certainly popular histories, he's kind of known as Bad King John, as a sort of a very poor king around the time of the Magna Carta. He's not a great lord of Ireland either. He creates great offence when he comes. He pulls on the Irish magnates' beards, who are where they're very long, and upsets a lot of people locally. Richard doesn't have children. Initially, the idea is that John was to take Ireland, Richard would have England and the French possessions, but because Richard dies relatively young and doesn't have children, John ends up inheriting both England and Ireland. And so the lordship is from that point kind of nailed on to England from this time afterwards. And they're to remain attached right up until, effectively for part of the island, until today. So it's a matter of considerable importance. Now, the incomplete conquest, because Ireland has, at this time, maybe up to about 40, possibly even more, autonomous or semi-autonomous territories, it's very difficult to conquer it quickly. And ultimately, the Anglo-Normans or the English failed to conquer the island fully in the medieval period. It's not up until 1603 when Ireland finally comes entirely under the control of Dublin Castle, which is the headquarters of the English state in Ireland. So in England, for instance, where a single crossbow bolt can take out the King of England when the Normans arrive there, that sort of a situation is impossible in Ireland, because even if you kill one, we use the word ri, meaning, which people take as meaning king, but it's a small kingdoms of small individual territories, not too dissimilar maybe to the size of a county today. And even if you kill one, you will then need to kill the other 39 afterwards. So having a complete conquest is a very difficult thing. So the way it emerges is quite different from England. But in the years after the initial conquest begins, into probably the early 13th century, from about 1210 onwards, we start to see the development of English law in Ireland as a normal setup within the kingdom. Now, it's very heavily based on the English model, for obvious reasons, I suppose. There's probably two reasons why. In the first instance, the people who are coming over to Ireland to work in the colony and to administer the system are themselves coming from England, where they're used to that court system, but also of the kingdom is based in England. It makes sense that the legal entity within that administration would develop along the same sort of lines when you've got so many other aspects of the English state that will be quite similar, if you know what I mean. So we've got mostly based in Dublin, although not always absolutely the case, are central law courts. And over the centuries, these develop into the Court of King's Bench, into the Court of Common Pleas, and into the Exchequer Court dealing mostly with revenue issues. The King's Bench, in theory, is for any court cases that involve the state or involve the king. The Common Pleas, more generally, or initially at least, are used to hear cases between individual litigants who aren't royal. And then later Chancery develops out of the medieval administrative court, where the court is mostly staffed by clergy, and they become keepers of the king's conscience in the same way that they do in England. and Chancery develops as a court of equity rather than a court of law, probably sometimes in the late 15th century, early 16th century, around about the same time that it's developing in England. And these become the four courts of the Lordship of Ireland, later the Kingdom of Ireland. We do see at the same time itinerant courts, courts of oyer and termine, which later on kind of evolve or are replaced by courts of assize, which are justices moving around the country, itinerant judges moving from county to county and dispensing both civil justice, that is between two individual litigants, or indeed criminal justice as well, which is between the king and his subjects. Also for smaller issues, we see the development similar as we see them in England, of much smaller courts. These might be baron courts or courts leet, or even pipe powder courts, which are relative to local manors and local towns. A lot of the time they'll be staffed by people in the immediate locality. We also see in 1216, just a year after it happened in England, a Magna Carta Hiberniae is dispatched to Ireland, and it is to have effect there. It's very, very similar to the English document, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215. A lot of the time it's just where you'll see the River Thames described in the Magna Carta, it becomes the River Liffey in the Magna Carta Hiberniae. Otherwise it's very, very similar. From 1265 onwards, at least, although it's probably been emerging in the years before that, we see the development of an Irish Parliament. Again, all of these courts are relevant only to the English colony, the areas where there's an Irish population. They have their own legal system, which I'll describe to you in a few moments. As sources of law, sorry, just to mention Parliament. First mentioning as Parliamentum in 1265. By the late 13th century, by I think it's 1297, we have members of the counties being represented, Knights of the Shire as such. A few years after that, we've got members from towns being elected. Into the 13th century, it's not automatically the case that members of what we start to call the Commons House, or members of the Commons that have not yet split into their individual houses, are not always being called, but it certainly is happening by them. As far as sources of law go in Ireland, Parliament certainly is creating law in Ireland. Sometimes Parliament in England is creating law for Ireland. Sometimes it's very specifically mentioning Ireland explicitly, and sometimes it's less explicit, but laws that are thought good in Ireland are sometimes just transferred over to, or found to work well in England, are sometimes just transferred over by writ to Ireland. And then also decisions by the judges, that common law system where precedents or stare decisis later on is used as a way of extending law and legal decisions, sometimes from England and sometimes within Ireland, that will be replicated in all the courts here. In some cases, we're seeing Irish men spending time in English universities in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and sometimes spending time at the English laws of Inns of Court and hanging around the forecourts in Westminster. And when they come back to Ireland, they're bringing that expertise and that knowledge with them. And indeed, from the 1540s onwards, the Act of Jealousales insists that Irish students who wish to practice as attorneys or barristers must spend time in England learning their trade, which is, for the Irish legal education system, is its own source of colonization. The Irish judiciary, they emerge from both Ireland and England, whether it's from kind of elite colonial families. And if you look at the lists of medieval and early modern judges, you'll see lots of the same families coming up, like Whites and Plunketts and Nugents and people like that. But also sometimes people are coming from England, and this injection of fresh blood into the colony as far as the law and legal knowledge goes is probably quite important in keeping that link with England and with the English common law system, because they're bringing that knowledge from England and planting it into Ireland. It's far more rare that you will get an Irish legal a person of the colony in Ireland going back to England being appointed as judges. Happens the odd time in the early modern period where somebody is sent over from England and they do quite well for themselves, and then they kind of get to go back, you know. as such, but it's not altogether common. Status and rights for the Irish community, or what we call the Gaelic Irish community, are very few in the Middle Ages. For the most part, they are essentially outside of the law. They have few rights in English law, and generally speaking, they don't make use of the courts. Now, even if they were permitted, would they have wanted to, of course, is a different story altogether. Quite possibly not. They had their own legal system, and it's important to remember that they have a system of Brehon law, which is an indigenous native Irish or Gaelic Irish legal system. It's mostly what we would now call in Ireland a civil law system. So there's no real sort of criminal law worth speaking of. When harms are done to people, a Brehon essentially sits the two litigants down in what can sometimes seem like almost a sort of a tribunal of sort of negotiation almost, and they will deliver a compensation based on the wrong or the harm done to the individual. So very little criminal law, very few instances of sort of corporal or capital punishment. And although, like I say, although Gaelic native Ireland was politically fragmented, the legal system is largely uniform across all of these petty kingdoms. So even though we have maybe 30 or 40 individual sort of statelets or counties around the Gaelic Irish areas, the legal system seems to be fairly uniformly transferred across all of these. English status could be purchased, where Irish individuals, they might end up taking on an English name, and in some cases they will actually pay money to become English as such, and to then have that status of an Englishman that allows them to use the courts and gives them certain privileges within the colony. Very important in the mid 14th century is called a series of enactments or chapters within the one law called the Statutes of Kilkenny. Now, these are nothing new as such. They've been mentioned in decades before they were promulgated, but this enactment of 1366 is probably the most famous one. And essentially, it stipulates in no uncertain terms that there is a division within Ireland, that the Gaelic Irish should be kept very separate. Some historians in the past have used the word apartheid. I'm not sure if it's entirely appropriate, so I've got a question mark after it for a specific reason. But essentially, it's an attempt to keep these two populations aside, because what we see quite soon after the Anglo-Normans arrive is inevitably they start connecting with the Gaelic Irish. One of the first things that Strongbow, the first warlord who arrives in Ireland, is to marry one of the local women, because that sort of ingratiates him within Irish society, and it gives him certain rights to the kingdom which he's just taken over. And this is happening at lower levels as well, where people are intermarrying. They're essentially taking on a lot of Gaelic Irish manners and mores and Gaelic culture. They're becoming, in the words of some historians, more Irish than the Irish themselves. And it's something that's very detrimental to the English colony, is that the English are sort of giving up on their Englishness. So whilst traditionally a lot of sort of nationalist-minded historians may have seen this simply as an aggressive mood of sort of cultural supremacy, I think these laws can sometimes be seen more as a sort of a fearful minority on the island who are under pressure and whose culture is being culture and status is being sort of whittled away by their own activity. And so the government are very worried that the English colony is disappearing before their eyes, not through force of arms, but by sort of cultural assimilation. And so these laws forbid intermarrying between Irish and English, the use of Irish names, the use of fosterage, which is very important in Irish society, where you essentially send your children out for a few years to another family, and because it builds up alliances and connections, but it also obviously, when English children are put out fostering in Irish families, they may come back more Irish. Sports like hurling, the Irish fondness for the moustache as opposed to a full beard. Irish haircuts, which tend to be more like me at the moment, a bit more perhaps raggedy, and seen as an uncivilized sort of way to have yourself. The sort of clothes that people are wearing, this control of clothing. I was shocked when I spent some time at the University of Vienna to find that we had a specialist who taught a specialist module in the history of law of clothing. fashion law as such. I know I've always heard of the fashion police, but not fashion law. But it's very important in the Middle Ages, sumptuary law in the same way within the English sphere over who can wear what. And we still see this in universities today when we get dressed up in our gowns, because all the colours and the stripes mean things, they make statements. But also things like entertainment, and also assuming church office within the English sphere. Ultimately, it's unenforceable. Cultural laws generally are, and we see in Ireland, we see the the inability of the English state to survive and to thrive. Now, there's probably a few reasons for that in the 1300s. In 1315, a guy called Edward the Bruce arrives over from Scotland on his own invasion in many respects. I think rather than he makes a number of important statements about, the Celtic cousins sort of coming together against the common enemy and things like that. But I suspect what he was really doing was trying to open up a second front in his brother's war against the English to get them out of Scotland. So what he does is there's a lot of burnings of towns, and the English state is destabilized even further in this period. Soon after that, we get the emergency in, I think it's 1348 or 1349, of the Black Death in Ireland, the bubonic plague. And this affects probably the English colony much more than the Irish one, because the Irish tend to focus on pastoral agriculture, which means that they're not in as close a contact, and towns aren't as prevalent in these Irish areas, whereas in the English colony, towns much more, and where people are gathered, obviously, like in COVID times, in large numbers, the disease will spread a lot more. So the two maps that you have above you there are Ireland at the colony's strongest point or high point around about maybe 1300, which is the blue areas. The areas left in green are those furthest from Dublin for the most part, but also those that are geographically less accessible, and also where Anglo-Norman military technology is less impressive. So for instance, if you look in the far southwest, where I come from originally, that area called Munster, that South Kerry area is very mountainous, so heavy cavalry isn't as much of an advantage, and the Irish way of fighting is far better. Same in County Clare, and the same up in the northwest. That large green area is a part of Ulster that is never taken over by the Anglo-Normans, and it only comes under the control of Dublin Castle in the years after 1603, when James I arrives onto the throne. And then the black and white picture, which is actually one that I had organised for a book that Alistair published with a number of other colleagues from the Parliamentary History Commission. That dark shaded area is probably the low point for the Irish colony, the English colony within Ireland, which we term the Pale, centred around Dublin. It's very good land, but it's shrunk considerably compared to what it used to be. And the law shrinks with it. So what we find is people who are living in those areas that had previously been part of the English colony, say in the Midlands or in the west of Ireland, in those blue areas, the King's Writ no longer runs in these areas. So we're finding that these people have less access to common law. They still might be having common law traditions or English legal traditions in their own areas, and they might be managing to survive and keeping that legal culture alive. But the idea of people leaving Dublin to go on a circuit, judges leaving Dublin to go on a circuit to somewhere like Tralee in the southwest or to Galway, is probably unthinkable in the early 1400s, because the colony has shrunk that much. And it's worth keeping in mind that the law, whilst in theory the law is fantastic and it spreads across the whole island, it's not enforceable in most parts of the country. So in many respects, when the English colony shrinks down to the 4 loyal shires that we see in that heavy shaded area in the black and white map, and that's as far as the King's Writ goes. And after that, it's sort of all bets are off. So with the resurgence of Gaelic Ireland or native Ireland in the period after 1350, their legal system is probably becoming a lot stronger. But we're also seeing emerge in the Middle Ages called marcher law. So you might be familiar with the term, at least in English historiography, of the Welsh marches. I think it comes from an old German word, mark, meaning sort of border or border area, borderland. And essentially, the marches in Ireland are the kind of in-between areas where you're not quite within the English colony, but you're not quite in a sort of a pure Gaelic Irish area either. And it's a hybrid system, it's a hybrid culture, and it's a hybrid population. And so the law obviously is going to reflect that. And so it's inevitable, I think, and I don't know if people would agree with me generally on this, but I think it's inevitable that a workable legal solution to problems will be found by people living in these border areas, where people who may want to keep a lot of that English culture or heritage alive as far as their legal culture goes, but where Dublin Castle, the core area of the jurisdiction, can't provide anymore that sort of protection. And this marcher law is this hybrid system of both the Gaelic Brehon law and the English common law to find a workable solution. I think the law will always find its solutions over time. So the example that I've got up there is one that I just came across quite recently. And on the right-hand side, that's just the opening of the same document that's on the right. But on the left-hand side, you'll see at the very top, it's an award in English of two Brehons, which is two judges from the Gaelic Irish legal tradition, along with others. And we can see the names of the people at the end of the document on the right. And there's people like the sheriff, for example, is there, but also two Brehon law judges who are sitting on what appears to be a sort of a panel of people coming together to make a decision on who owns a certain patch of land in County Tipperary. And there's about 7 people altogether. So what's very interesting to most historians who looked at that in the past, and I've mentioned it, is that the first name, we can't see his actual name, but it's marked with his sign, with his mark, his cross, is for the sheriff, who is very definitely a representative of the English legal tradition. And then the third and the fourth names, Misha Donica Maclanish and Misha Murtic Maclanish, these are the modern English version of that name would be Clancy, are representatives of the Brehon or Gaelic law tradition who are sitting on the same panel as judges with English judges and coming to a decision. And it seems to me kind of quite similar to a sort of a binding arbitration panel of law in the 1540s. But what I found most interesting, and it's very noteworthy that legal historians who have mentioned this document before haven't made note, or not to the best of my knowledge, that we actually have a female judge sitting on that panel as well. I've got her marked in red, Dame Eleanor Fitzjohn. She's there because she's the lady of that territory. She's the over kind of lord of that particular region. So presumably her husband has died, or maybe her son hasn't yet grown up to inherit the land. But either way, she's making an impact, not just as a powerful woman in her own right, but actually taking a formal legal position in this example. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Irish law or medieval Ireland or even early modern Ireland is kind of a feminist wonderland or anything like that. But I do think that this is a point that's worth making, that it's very, very interesting that we do have a woman acting as a judge in this instance. I'm not saying it's common, but it does happen nonetheless. And this marcher law, and you'll see these marcher kind of territories in Wales. I'm sure you probably see it in Scotland as well, where in these border areas, legal solutions have to present themselves because you're far away from Edinburgh and you're far away from London, and people make do to the best of the ability that they can. In 1460 then, as we're beginning to depart from the Middle Ages, usually we cut off the Middle Ages in Ireland probably in about maybe the 1530s, when the Reformation kind of finally kicks off in Ireland. But I think from a law perspective and from a history of parliaments perspective, we're probably best to think of the late 1400s as a good cutoff point for the Middle Ages. And one point that's really interesting, it comes up, now it's just a very brief kind of period where Ireland becomes, it seems to me, quite important in English history as well, as during the Wars of the Roses, civil wars in 15th century England, when England becomes quite weakened and Ireland has some importance. That Richard, Duke of York, who is one of the belligerents in the Wars of the Roses, is defeated in battle in England, and he becomes essentially a refugee back to Ireland, where he had been based in the 1450s, and he had been quite popular. And he had spent a lot of time here, and it's not that common for an English Lord Lieutenant, the representative of the King in Ireland, to spend quite so much time and to have such a prominent somebody from close to the royal family to be here. It happens the odd time, but most of the time it's contracted out to local Irish magnates. And when he arrives here, he's very concerned that an English Parliament or English courts will attaint him and adjudge him to be guilty of treason. And Parliament, with his encouragement, passes a law in 1460 that makes 2 points. Now, I think it's just for the immediate benefit of Richard, Duke of York, to stop him from being attainted by law or to have writs sent to him from the English Chancery. But what they suggest is that the law suggests that Ireland has complete legislative autonomy and that England has no right to make law for Ireland. Now, we do know that they had make law on and off at times before this point, and they will do later on as well. But it's a very interesting statement, and it's one that comes up again in the 17th century and the 18th century, and Ireland's colonial status very much centers around some of these points. It centers around other things as well, like the right to trade and whether Ireland should be treated differently, and English people in Ireland, do they have the same rights and liberties as English people in England? But this constitutional status becomes very important in Ireland. Does Ireland have sole right to legislate for Ireland, or can England do it as well? Is England this sort of kind of imperial mother parliament? And also that writs initiated in England were not of any force in Ireland, therefore that Irish courts don't have to, people in Ireland don't have to answer writs that are drawn up in England, in the same way that people in Scotland at the time, an entirely independent country, wouldn't recognise any English writs either. And this is a very important statement as well, because it suggests that, at least in this instance, that Ireland is not a colony, but is a sort of a co-equal entity. I've written kingdom, I should have written entity because it's not yet a kingdom, but a co-equal kingdom under the monarch, rather than being a sort of a much smaller one under England. This independence does not last long, but the noteworthy as very early utterances of issues that will arise regularly in Irish legal history there afterwards. Irish status with regards to writs, whether the courts in England oversee Ireland and oversee Irish courts, and also whether Parliament, the greatest court of all, has the right to legislate for Ireland, or whether the Irish Parliament has that right solely of itself. Partially as a response to this sort of what Curtis had probably unwisely referred to as aristocratic home rule for Ireland, and partially as other English characters being set up in England in the late 1490s. Poyning's Law is another important constitutional document still on the syllabus for school children in Ireland up to the 20th century, although I don't think it is anymore, or at least I don't believe so. Poyning's Law ensured that essentially ties the Irish Parliament into a position of subservience by suggesting that all Irish legislation must from this point be sent to London for confirmation before being returned to the Irish Parliament, where it then can be accepted or rejected but not amended. Essentially, it was there initially to protect the Irish Parliament from being dominated by a local Lord Lieutenant, but later on it becomes a limitation on Parliament and its ability to initiate its own statute law. So essentially what it's saying is the Irish Parliament, like say the English Parliament the Irish Parliament cannot just set up its own readings of bills and then present them for royal assent to be formally converted into acts. Essentially, it says in advance it's got to send the bills over to London, where they can ignore them, they can amend them, they can reject them, or they can send them back as they are, to then go before the Irish Parliament, where they can then be either accepted or rejected, but not critically amended. So essentially, it's taking that initiating right out of the Irish Parliament's hands. Initially, like I say, it's a way of protecting the Irish Parliament from being kind of bullied by overpowerful aristocratic characters in Ireland. But as we go into, particularly into the 17th and into the 18th century, it becomes a major issue of contention for people then. Another act of this Parliament, which I think is important to remember in terms of the legal status of Ireland as a colony or not, is an act which transfers all English public legislation up to this point over to Ireland that essentially says, as statute law goes at least, Irish law is now identical, or at least English law, English public law has all been transferred into Ireland. So there should be a very strong similarity between the two systems. Up to this point, Ireland had been passing its legislation, England passing its. Sometimes they'd use the same acts, but sometimes they pass them quite differently. So it's just bringing Ireland much more closely under the supervision of England. And I think this is important. I think this is seen across the early modern period in lots of countries where we begin to get the core centres of power are beginning to rein in the outerlying provinces. So I think you can see it in Spain in particular, where we get the coalesce of many different provinces under powerful monarchs like the Christian monarchs in 1492 and beyond. In France, you begin to see it as well, not completed until the 17th century. Maybe even, I don't know, Alistair, if you'll get upset by this, but maybe bringing Scotland into that entity as well. And again, it's a process that goes on up into the 18th century, but essentially making London the focus for power within the dominions, and those outerlying countries or provinces have to sort of toe the line to a certain extent. I know to a point Scotland doesn't really fit that model in the same sort of way. But you see it in the Netherlands as well, with the 14 provinces beginning to coalesce in the later 1500s as well. And then one thing which I always find quite almost humorous is that the exact to replicate English law into Ireland. At the same time, then a third law is passed which makes murder in Ireland treason, unlike in England. So at the same time that they're saying we want all of your law to be the same, they're also bringing in another law which says, actually, let's make it a bit different because Ireland is different. The reasoning behind this law, it's not a big constitutional act, but it's essentially saying nobody in Ireland takes the traditional punishment for murder, which is hanging, seriously enough. So we're going to make it treason so that we can hang them, draw them, and quarter them. Essentially, cutting out people's insides and cutting them up into small pieces and putting their head on a spike. So this is something that comes up in Ireland again in the colonial experience. It's essentially saying, be just like us, but at the same time, be different. Take on the colonial project demands that the local population takes on English culture and language and religion and economic systems and things like that. But at the same time, it always says we're going to treat you a bit differently. And you can see that in the Americas in the 1770s, where it's very much an English colony, English language and English religion and all that sort of thing. But then they're not giving the same sort of liberties that freeborn Englishmen in England have. And I think we see that in Ireland to a certain point as well. Now, moving on quite quickly around the things, but we've got kind of lots to cover. The big problem comes, I mentioned Reformed religion, is when Henry VIII becomes Protestant, and we end up going back to think about the Bull Laudabiliter, that papal grant in the 1150s that essentially gives papal permission and encouragement to the English to take over Ireland with a view to reforming Ireland, its culture and its church in particular. But obviously, when Henry VIII rejects papal sovereignty over his dominions, that becomes a problem for Ireland. So we get an act which essentially converts Ireland from being a lordship into a full kingdom. And crucially, all of the people of the island are now his subjects. Up to this point, his subjects generally were just the English of Ireland. The Gaelic Irish were always considered to be outside or beyond the pale, to be not part of the setup. In practice, I think there's very little change to the courts, to the laws, or to the population at large. Much of the island still remains unconquered in Henry VIII's time. Slowly but surely, the colony is starting to recover, but we have to wait until the end of the Elizabethan Wars, just literally about a week or two after she dies in 1603, before Ireland is fully under English control, under the control of Dublin Castle. But there is a genuine start here for a fresh start in many respects. This statement that all of the people of the island are now subjects of the king means that they have access to law. And we start to see, for example, legislation dividing the natives from the newcomers, from the planter community, is starting to be to be repealed. And in the following decades, and also after 1603, anti-Scottish legislation becomes repealed as well, because from 1603, James VI of Scotland, who's James I of Ireland and James I of England, is now on the throne. So obviously Scotland and England and Ireland are all best pals now, and anti-Scottish legislation has to be put away. The big crucial point, I think, essentially is that the Gaelic Irish generally didn't want to convert and didn't want to become English. And also, I think what's really important to remember, generally when speaking about colonies and empires, is that the planter community, and especially the new planter community, the new Protestant planter community, uh, don't always necessarily want the local native community to convert either, because it's like being in a golf club or in a learned society where you get extra letters after your name. If everybody is allowed into the golf club, it's no longer special. You're no longer an elite. And you can see this very much, obviously, in race in places like Africa in their colonial experiences, say in the 19th century, where it becomes very easy to divide people on the basis of the color of their skin and to keep that separateness there. And so the elite is defined by the color of their skin. In Ireland, that colonial elite is defined by identity, specifically by racial identity in the Middle Ages. But as the new kingdom in 1542 comes into place, that racial distinction is ideally something that should disappear according to the law. But we get to see the beginnings of the Reformation, and that elite now becomes Protestant instead of English. For a lot of people, it's the same thing, because English and Protestantism is being defined as being very close together, as is Irishness and Catholic in Ireland as well, from the late 1500s onwards afterwards. So like I say, the racial divides are officially disappearing, but they are being replaced by confessional divides, where most of the old colonial community, we'll call them the Old English or the Anglo-Norman community, and the Gaelic Irish remain Catholic. The new colonial community, the New English, are overwhelmingly Protestant. Um, but there is big change coming. Like I say, in 1603, the entire island comes under the actual. It always had a de jure sovereignty, but we actually see a realistic impression of what total control from Dublin Castle is after 1603, particularly after 1607, when very powerful aristocrats of Gaelic origins depart from Ireland and head off to the continent. At that point, as far as getting back to the law goes, in the criminal law particularly, and civil law, because the assize courts have civil hearings as well in Ireland, but the assize and the quarter sessions are now being extended into the entire island. So places like Donegal, for example, in the far northwest, for the first time, will be experiencing the realities of English law in their locality, that the courts will come to town and that they will hear. And the people who are on those early sessions are saying about how wonderful it is that all the poor oppressed natives are coming and seeing the great benefits of His Majesty's justice, and what a wonderful thing our superior form of law is. Now, I think a lot of people in the Irish localities may not have shared that enthusiasm in all likelihood, or at least some of them. But it's a very important thing to look at. But I think what's most important is, we think of a figure like Sir John Davies, who's well known in England as a Renaissance man. He writes poetry and is a legal thinker as well. And in Ireland, he fulfills the role of Solicitor General and later Attorney General. And more than anyone, he's probably one of the great proponents of using the law as a colonial tool of cultural dominance. Some people might even say oppression, from his point of view of spreading kind of English culture and the benefits of Englishness across. That's what the colonial project is all about for him, to a point. And he's the man who made the comments about how well the Irish are enjoying the fruits of a he would term it civilized form of law within this. But at the same time, we must recognize that the English state is using prerogative justice, something that's very unpopular in England. The Court of Castle Chamber, provincial presidencies, I should have written there, in the localities, which a lot of commentators have suggested is a very harsh form of justice. The use of martial law, military law in Ireland, at times when there is no war, is something that would not or generally doesn't happen in England. So at the same time, whilst they're saying, look and take all of the wonderful things that the common law brings, all the liberties of the subject, where you can be protected away from that sort of what they would have termed barbaric Irish law system. Yet at the same time, they're using very harsh systems of law that would not be used in England. So the idea that we're replicating English law in Ireland, it's not quite as easy to say that, because what happens in Ireland in the 17th century, in particular, in a time of peace, would not be acceptable in England. And Sir John Davies, you can see it in his parliaments as well, where he rigs very heavily the electoral system in favour of Protestant MPs. And had he done that in England, I guarantee you his head would be on a block in no time. But in Ireland, he's seen as a sort of almost as a hero, funded mostly from his own writings, I might add, but as a hero of that colonisation process. And so it's very interesting. It's very noteworthy that the use of language in the courts as well. We have some examples. So officially, English is the language of the criminal law courts. The law has been written up until the 1490s, mostly in Norman French, but after that it's becoming English as well. But a lot of Irish people can't access the law in the same way, or they have to use interpreters to do it. Cromwellian judges who come to Ireland in the 1650s, for example, make a big fuss of making English the only language of the courts. And essentially in England, they make a big fuss out of saying we're opening up the law books and making the law accessible to the people in a language that they can understand. And the exact same figure, somebody like John Cook, a regicide, who comes to Munster as a judge and says the same sort of thing in Ireland. Isn't this great? We're opening up the law to the people in a language that they understand, i.e. not Latin and not Norman French. But it's a language, it's English, and lots of people in Ireland can't understand that language. So it comes elsewhere in 1640 and 1641, at the beginning of what are probably the most destructive wars in Irish history, the 1641 to 1653 conflict. There's big questions being asked about Ireland's status by common lawyers, heroes of the common law in Ireland like Patrick Darcy, who's asking what exactly is Ireland's status? Does that Irish Parliament have the sole right to push its own legislation? Or can a foreign parliament, as he's maybe terming it at the time, where Irish representatives don't sit, can they make laws for Ireland? And what does that say about the liberties and the just rights of people who are the descendants of the English community in Ireland? And that becomes very different. All comes to nothing, of course, because the Irish civil wars don't go well for the people in Ireland, for any of them, whether they be Catholic or Protestant. And when Cromwell arrives in Ireland, it's we're kind of almost going to ground zero status. It's just widespread violence, famine, disease. The population of Ireland drops considerably, but they also bring the establishment of a Protestant English Republican regime to Ireland and a union with England. It might seem, if you study Northern Irish politics, almost counterintuitive that the first time that Ireland experienced republicanism is by sort of theocratic, kind of hardcore Protestant zealots, maybe even extremists. I don't think is too strong a word. But in that union, which is also a union with Scotland as well, a small number of MPs go to London, large-scale expropriation of land, and it's a massive legal study in itself of just how you transfer ownership of land from a native community, or indeed from the old Anglo-Norman or Old English community, over to the newcomer, the native the newcomer planter community. And this is going on from the late 1500s, but it happens with real gusto in the 1650s. And as the Restoration comes to Ireland, the constitutional clock is essentially turned backwards. It's a very interesting issue in itself of what happens to the law in a revolutionary regime. And you can never turn the clock back. You can't. The word restoration is a misnomer in many ways. But as far as the law goes, they literally say the last 10 years didn't happen for the most part, with the exception of things like the efforts at land reform. The new planter community holds most of the land after this period. And most interestingly enough, the last sort of gasp for the Stuarts, or the old school Stuarts at least, in Ireland, James II arrives, James VII in Scotland, which Alistair, who's here in the audience, has obviously written a superb book about him as King of Scots. He arrives in Ireland in March 1689, essentially a king on the run, a refugee from England, where he's had to essentially run away from because he's made himself so unpopular. As King of Ireland, he's certainly de facto king when he arrives, but whether he's de jure king, because the 1542 Act that establishes Ireland as a kingdom says that Ireland is always wedded and knit to the imperial crown of England, that the King of Ireland is always going to be the King of England. They can't go their separate ways. They're like conjoined twins. You know, they're connected at the hip as such. But they pass another act, which I think is very, very similar to that 1460 Act, declaring that Parliaments of England cannot bind Ireland. And also the second section relates to the ability of English courts to initiate writs over to Ireland, you know, for arrest or for ownership of property or whatever else. And we see a area of reform. How am I doing on time, Nina? Do I have lots of time left, or I'm okay?
No fixed limit.
Okay, well, I won't push people too hard, because I am wary that it's a Friday evening and you're on a holiday week, and so I'm surprised anybody has come, to be quite honest. From the 18th century, the quote at the top that I give, Golden Age or Penal Era, is related to a very fine collection of essays. I think that came out probably in the 1970s. I think it was Thomas Bartlett and David Hayton that edited them, and the subtitle was Golden Age or Penal Era. And it's worthy of note that some of the kind of most progressive, kind of not the most progressive, I suppose, but a very fine time for Irish development in terms of architecture and laying out of towns, and the growth of Dublin as a city to become effectively the second city of the empire, which it is for much of the 18th century. Great prosperity and great buildings and great literature, great cultural achievements, but also comes at the same time of what we call the penal era. It's a word that, it's a strange sort of a word, because penal obviously can refer to anything criminal, but the penal laws are a collection of laws that relate to how the small, effectively it's a Protestant or a planter elite, they become kind of Irish in the 1690s and the early 1700s themselves, or start to more identify with Ireland. But how these series of laws can be used to control the large amount of the population. And Ireland's a very strange country in early modern Europe, because lots of countries will have minorities of different religious groups within them. But Ireland, I think, and I may be open to correction here, but I think Ireland is probably the only country in early modern Europe where a considerable majority, and we're talking 75, 80% of the population, is Catholic, but they're not the community that are in power. So in France, we have a Huguenot minority, but France is a Catholic country. In the Netherlands or in Scotland, they're Calvinist countries, or Presbyterian, as we might use the term here, but there will be Catholic minorities in those countries, but essentially the elite and the governance are Protestant and are Calvinist in that way. In Ireland, the minority are the elite and are the colonial majority. But maybe that's a case that Ireland, in some ways, is very much that colony status, and that maybe we should be comparing it to countries on the other side of the Atlantic in this period, rather than comparing it with France or the Netherlands, you know. So colonial nationalism becomes, for this elite group, for this Protestant community within Ireland, like I say, it only makes up maybe 20-25% of the population. And even there, it's split probably in two, between those of the state established Church of Ireland, which is kind of a modern Protestant group, and the non-conforming Protestants of Ireland, made up mostly of Presbyterians, many of whom will be of Scottish origin, but also some smaller groups that may have come over in the 1650s or afterwards, like Quakers or Congregationalists. Colonial nationalism actually is really a response, I think, to a growing imperial identity with London, that London is becoming very dominant. And really this is a post-Glorious Revolution effect of what happens is when the English Parliament finally decide that they need to take control, that they can't trust monarchs in the way that they had to do in previous decades, and they begin to dominate the monarchy. And that transfer of sovereignty, which moves from monarch, I'm not sure England ever really had an absolutist system, but when it moves from monarch being where sovereignty really lay to this more sharing system where in actual fact, as far as politics go, Parliament is becoming the dominant partner in the relationship in the way that kings had been maybe a century or two before that. But what happens is that even though Ireland and England share the same monarch, we're beginning to see that when Parliament begins to take control, Ireland is not entirely sure where they sit within that power relationship anymore. And we find inevitably that the king will take sides with his own English Parliament rather than the Irish one, even though he is King of Ireland in effect as much as he is King of England. Colonial nationalism from 1692 onwards is identifies a series of debates and sometimes clashes with this new power dynamic that's going on in London at Westminster, where Parliament are beginning to assert themselves more. So traditionally, the Irish Parliament rejected the power of the English Parliament over them and said, we answer sort of more to the king, but increasingly they're having to answer more to the English Parliament in that post 1688 Glorious Revolution period. So, for instance, the idea of a sole right to initiate legislation in Ireland, this kind of Protestant nationalism that we're starting to see, is something that had been just 3 years before that. The Catholic Parliament under James II had been saying, can Ireland initiate its own legislation? Is England allowed to do it? Because MPs elected for an English Parliament are elected in England, not from Ireland. So they have no sort of sense that they're representing Irish people or Irish interests. And the effect that the Protestants find in post 1691 Ireland is that they're also starting to be treated like a colonial community or a bit more like the Irish, and they're not actually seeing all the full benefits of being English as English people are. So this idea, like I say, of how to initiate legislation, things like the Woolen Acts, where Irish woolen exports have to be sent to England and only to England, I think only to a few restricted ports, and they can't trade wool with Spain or France or any other countries. And this is very important again because it's fitting Ireland within this emerging first English empire of trying to identify what's Ireland's status, and it's being treated more and more like Jamaica or like the states of what becomes the USA 70 years later. Things like the navigation laws, which says that Irish trade with the colonies must be via England and on English shipping. These had come in the 1650s. They're reiterated again in the 1650s, again in the 1660s, and again into the later period, where Ireland's status under the monarch is very much secondary to that of what England has. And that whereas before you might have been able to say that sovereignty or ownership of colonies were within the king, were the king's by right, they've now been transferred more over to the English Parliament. And so the Irish Parliament isn't going to be seeing any of the action or the benefits of that imperial trade, and that she has been increasingly treated as another colony. And so its status is coming under very considerable pressure. By 1720, a very important act has passed, which stamps, and again goes back to our twin concerns that we've seen in 1460, in the 1640s, again in 1688, or 1689 in Ireland, is this Declaratory Act, which essentially says, on no uncertain terms, and it's an explicit statement, which we haven't seen before from the English Parliament in the same way, that laws for Ireland can be passed by the English Parliament, irregardless of what the Irish Parliament has to say about the matter. England can legislate for Ireland. So this kind of dynamic about what parliamentary representation actually means becomes very stark indeed for Irish people and for Irish MPs as well, because it's a denigration of the rights of the Irish Parliament in that regard. And also we see the Westminster Parliament explicitly states that it is the final court of appeal for Ireland. And Irish cases had been heard in appeal in Westminster before this point, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, I might add, but also heard at Dublin. But finally, they're stating again in explicit terms that the Irish Parliament does not have status as a court of appeal, and that the Westminster Parliament is that. So as far as the law goes, Ireland's constitutional status is taking quite a battering at this stage, I think. Like I say, despite this, 18th century Ireland is a thriving economy, developing culturally. It's a real golden age in many respects for Irish development. At the same time, within Ireland, so whilst Irish Protestant MPs, the Irish Parliament is exclusively Protestant from 1692 onwards, are kind of complaining or indeed whinging about the denigration of their rights as subjects of the king. Also, Catholics and to some extent Presbyterians under the penal laws also are having to live with very difficult circumstances. Again, this might take us back to those statutes of Kilkenny's, those racially kind of motivated statutes that sought to keep separateness between the English and the Irish of the kingdom of the lordship in the 1360s. We're now also seeing it in the early 1700s about how does the Protestant minority that is in control in Ireland deal with what they see as a threat from the Catholics, that they're very concerned. So again, whether we see these laws essentially as a form of kind of confessional aggression against the Catholic community, or whether we see it as a sign of Protestant fear of domination by a much bigger majority. And again, you can look perhaps at the way other colonies do things abroad, whether that be in Africa or the Caribbean, South or Central America, or anywhere else, of how that small colonial elite seeks to dominate the population that were there beforehand. And there's a series of anti-Catholic laws from the 1690s onwards, explicitly banning Catholics from the legal profession and from office generally. And many Presbyterians are also barred from high office because they won't take a test act. The right to sit in Parliament, now very few of them are being elected anyway by this point, but keeping Catholics out of there. Things like carrying arms, that right to bear arms that we hear so much from, say, from the USA, is a real matter for concern of, again, the Protestant community say at the time it's about the preservation of their safety. Also owning a horse, this always kind of gets a giggle that Catholics are not permitted to own a horse worth more than £5. Some people will claim that being forced to ride around on cheap horses is a kind of an effort at humiliation and that sort of thing. Other people will say it's a way of keeping horses that are worthy of use in it as cavalry horses in military engagement out of Catholic hands as part of that necessity of preservation of security. Also, laws on intermarrying. Catholics can't inherit Protestant-owned land. Acts restricting foreign education, sending Catholics abroad to be educated. Banishment of regular clergy, that is clergy in orders, comes from the Latin regula, following a rule. And the Catholic hierarchy of bishops. The registration of secular clergy. Catholic clergy are never banned in their entirety. Sometimes kind of common culture of Ireland and their how kind of people, by which I mean sort of non-professional historians, remember the penal laws is of priest hunters and mass rocks and sort of people, which happens in Ireland today with the COVID rules, secret masses happening to satiate parishioners. Clergy are allowed, but they've got to take an oath of, a promise that they will behave themselves, and they're registered. Their name goes into a book. Also, the Act for the Future Prevention of Popery, the very important Act from 1703, which relates to the inheritance, the land law of Ireland, stating that it's one of the great sort of kind of ironies of colonial law in Ireland across many centuries is that a traditional Brehon or Gaelic law of land transfer and inheritance suggested that land would normally be divided equally amongst all of the sons of the person who dies. Now, the effect of that is it splits the land up, so big estates are difficult to keep because they keep on getting broken up. And traditionally, one of the great sort of civilizing efforts by people like Sir John Davies was to get rid of things like gavelkind, which is this interpretation of how land should be divided equally, and instead introduce and promote primogeniture, which is the eldest son inherits all of the estate or almost all of the estate. The Act of 1703 essentially goes back to what had been described previously as a barbaric custom of land inheritance, because by forcing all of the males of the family to take an equal share of the inheritance means that the estates are broken up. So it's kind of seen as an effort to maybe to impoverish or to destabilize these great estates. And the net effect of all of these is that we see land ownership amongst Catholic community goes right down to probably less than 10% in the 18th century, making them poorer, making them less able to reassert themselves. And again, kind of going back to the idea of, is this a scared Protestant community or is it a dominant, aggressive one? It's a difficult one. It's very worth emphasizing, though, that particularly the Presbyterian community also suffers under these laws. This is not just a simple Catholic versus Protestant issue. It is for some people to a point, but it's also about the established church and those who are outside the tent. And the Presbyterians are, to a certain point, outside. There are certain privileges. They're privileged to a point in terms of that hierarchy, but they're not at the top of the table by any means. And so they aren't allowed to take office within the towns, which means they don't have as much influence within things like Parliament or other areas like that. 1782, I'm coming towards the end of my lecture, you'll be delighted to know. In 1782, with the retreat of threats of Jacobitism in Ireland and elsewhere, and with growing sense of enlightenment, and Ireland really is part of that enlightenment culture, the ideas of removing many of the penal laws that persecute minorities, or in Ireland's case, the majority, simply on the basis of their religious affiliation being sort of ethically or morally wrong. Many of the penal laws start to get done away with by the 1770s and the 1780s. So they're only there for maybe 70, 80 years, although they do significant damage to the Catholic community. And the right to sit in Parliament has to wait until 1829. And indeed, even to this day, you might think that, well, you know, I'm probably kind of nitpicking here to a point, but things like religious test to be holding the throne in England is you have to be Protestant. Now that's because there's an established church within England, I understand that. But even up until very recently, the idea of the Prince of Wales marrying a Catholic was illegal up until relatively recently. But I think for practical senses, they're mostly gone by the early 1800s. Also, I think the American Wars has a great impression on Ireland. A lot of people are reading, like I say, Enlightenment texts, and people like Thomas Paine and people like this. A lot of pamphlets from the Americas are coming back to Ireland, and there's a huge connection, particularly between the Ulster Scots, the Presbyterians, Calvinists in the European terminology, who have gone from sort of Scotland a few generations later into Ireland, and then a few generations after that over to North America. And if you go through the list of early American presidents and prominent American politicians in that revolutionary period and afterwards, loads of them will be these Ulster Scots or these Scots-Irish community. And so a lot of the ideas that are fizzing about in North America about liberty and rights and colonial rights are coming back into Ireland as well. And the government are terrified that you're going to see something similar happening in Ireland. So after concerted pressure, and I think getting quite clever about the prospects of what they're facing down the line, there's a new constitution agreed to in Ireland, going back to our earlier issues around legislative independence, a thorough reevaluation of Poynings law. It doesn't get rid of it entirely, but it says that the Irish Privy Council has no involvement in the process anymore. So legislation can be generated by the Irish Parliament, and it will go to England for confirmation, but can't be amended, and then comes back to Ireland to be passed. So it passes a lot more power into the hands of Irish legislators. Also, the Irish, sorry, I wrote government there. I did this in a rush earlier today. The Irish Parliament, I mean, recovered its appellate right to be the final court of appeal, and the Irish House of Parliament in central Dublin, where we've given papers before. If you are a member of the Parliamentary History Commission, ICH or PI, we've held meetings in that building. They get a large block on the basis of the judicial work returning to them after 1782 and get a big portico on the outside of it as a result. So they recover their rights as far as legislation go. They recover their rights to appellate jurisdiction. And most interestingly, England no longer has that right to legislate for Ireland. So Ireland's colonial status maybe is rising in the 1780s as a result of this. But this leads to problems down the line as well. That if Ireland is reasserting, particularly the Irish Parliament is reasserting its constitutional right almost as a co-equal of England, it leads to trouble down the lines around trade, because you can't have two sort of dominant figures in that imperial setup. So, for example, England, there's fears that Ireland will be undercutting England because they can produce more cheaply in Ireland. So there's fears from English traders there. When the Regency Crisis comes up in the late 1700s, when George III, you've seen the movie The Madness of King George, where there's queries about who will become the regent of England if he doesn't recover. And as it happens, it doesn't happen until later on in post-1800s. But there's a fear that whilst England might decide to have one royal prince perhaps as the regent for England, couldn't the Irish Parliament have their own regent as regent for Ireland? And are we in danger of sort of driving a wedge between the two kingdoms? And I think above all, what really scares people is that Ireland has gone from reading a lot of American ideas about the American Revolution and just liberties and rights, which isn't really all that revolutionary in some ways, to starting to read French material, which is dangerously revolutionary, a la 1789 and everything that comes after that. And we get a French invasion of Ireland not in huge numbers, but French soldiers do land in 1798. What's very worrying is that Catholics and Protestants, some Protestants at least, have to a point joined together, and there's real fears that Ireland could end up becoming a French satellite state at the time. And so there's a number of reasons why people agree in England and to a point in Ireland that a union is the best way forward. It solves all of those problems. And so what we get in the 1800 Act of Union, in some ways perhaps similar to the 1707 Union that England and Scotland have come together with, the abolition of the Irish Parliament, an institution that's been meeting since the 1260s, very prominently in the Middle Ages, a little less so in the 16th and the 17th century, but then comes back with a vengeance in the 18th century, is gone. And it's finished, and that's it. From 1800 onwards, it sends representatives to Westminster, probably with a better deal as far as that goes than the Scots got in 1707. It keeps Irish law somewhat distinct. Pre-1800 statutes stay on the statute books as they were, so Irish law and English law doesn't become the same body at all. A clearing project we don't see until 2007, where a load of people in the Attorney General's office gathered and went through medieval Irish legislation with tooth comb and said, what do we need to get rid of? And it's a very interesting project to do. I'm not entirely sure it's a good idea. I'm always worried that there'll be some unforeseen result when you get rid of a law that lawyers think doesn't have any repercussions into the modern age, but might be found to do. I think to a certain point, if it's not broke, you don't fix it and just leave sleeping dogs lie. Those, 14th century laws saying that you've got to go out and shoot arrows every Saturday morning, or there's a penalty of 2 shillings a year or something, just leave them on the books. They've got no relevance whatsoever. But when you start clearing stuff out, it's like clearing out the clothes in your wardrobe. When somebody, I wouldn't mention names now, but when somebody close to you decides that your wardrobe needs to be cleared out, sometimes something very precious to you gets thrown out with it as well. And occasionally, even post-1800, we see Irish-specific legislation is passed. So there might be specific laws passed for example, Irish policing is quite different from English policing. The Irish police force is generally armed. They tend to work in a different sort of way. Things like public security and public order laws can be a bit harsher in Ireland. The English the politicians of Westminster would say that that's an unfortunate but necessary evil, because Ireland is a destabilized country and that's the way it is. But like I say, the legal system remains quite distinct. So whilst there's a parliamentary union, there's not a legal union. Same as in Scotland, they keep Scots law, they keep a separate system. It sounds very different, different personalities, different offices. It all works in an entirely different manner. Ireland, even though it's based on the English legal model, it keeps its system of courts. They do send final appeals over to London, to the House of Lords. But they keep all their judges, they keep their King's Bench, their Common Pleas and stuff like that. They keep their Lord Chancellor, they keep their Attorney General. So whilst Ireland's system is heavily based on a Westminster model, it has a common law system, but with elements that are specific and particular to Ireland into the 19th century and indeed into the 20th century, both in terms of precedent and in terms of statute law. So in terms of finishing up now, what are the themes that come out? So I realize that I've taken you on a sort of a whirlwind kind of whistle-stop tour of sort of legal history and constitutional landmark issues. But I think that there's certain themes and commonalities that we will see from the very earliest days of the colony right up to, in some cases, to the modern day. And that is that the idea of law and how it works, and constitutional matters to perhaps a lesser extent and how they work, frequently involve issues surrounding identity. And in the medieval period, as I was saying, that may be racial identity and separateness, or you can use the word apartheid if you like. I don't think I always use it. I'm not sure it's 100% appropriate, because it's very different from what we understand apartheid to be in 20th century, somewhere like South Africa. Also religious apartheid, or religious separateness and identity, becomes very, very important as well. And this is something that does make an impact on the law. Obviously, law as it's built, reflects the society where it comes from or which it cares to express itself in. So we shouldn't be too surprised by that. And when you've got a colony like Ireland, which will always have a sort of a native community and a newcomer community or a planter community, and the planter community will always be replaced by a new wave of immigrants coming in, a new wave of colonists, and those people who had previously been the planter community and the colonial elite are replaced and become part of the mass of the native community thereafter. And so these issues around identity, I think, are crucial. Land, I think you can't study Irish history in the Middle Ages, or particularly the early modern period in the 17th century. You just cannot get away from that land question, because it's essentially tied up in wealth. Ireland is kind of under-urbanized compared to a lot of European countries in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. So the generation of urban wealth, whilst it certainly happens, and we do have some prominent cities where trade and manufacture is very important, but landed wealth really is the only show in town for large periods, and it's very, very important to acknowledge that. By the 18th century, maybe a little bit less so, but before that. And then I think the whole issue around the kingdom or the colony status. What is Ireland's status? Is it very definitely a colony, and is it to be compared like the American colonies, or like, it's very interesting to note. I think it was Jennifer Wells, an American historian of the law in Ireland and elsewhere, who mentioned to me, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's a representative in the Jamaican Parliament in sometime in the later 17th century, when they're getting a sort of a law like Poyning's law, which restricts the initiative that they can make in creating their own laws entirely of themselves. Somebody pipes up and say, we're not like Ireland, we don't want to be treated like Ireland, which is very interesting, that what is certainly an out-and-out colony like Jamaica, if I remember correctly, is sort of saying we don't want to be treated like Ireland, which has a dubious status as to whether it's certainly not an equal kingdom to England. That's never the case, I don't think, and I don't think anybody thinks that it could be, or even tries to say that it would be. But it's not always treated the same as an out-and-out colony as we might see in the early modern period or other periods. So I know everybody thinks their country is a little bit different and not entirely typical of any other ones, but in some ways I think maybe there's a justification for suggesting that about Ireland. And then afterwards, I think which is probably a question I'm not sure I can entirely answer, but I think probably the latter of, is this to a plan or is there a happenstance? Is this just a series of events that happens, or I don't think there's any big point where people suggest that we'll come over and set up a colony and we'll work Ireland as a colony for centuries afterwards. When we see the initial Anglo-Norman invasions happening, it's just on a spur of the moment. There's guys like Strongbow, who's the initial Anglo-Norman leader who comes over, really needs to get out of England for a while because he's been on the losing side in their civil war with the Empress Matilda, and it's a way for him to get out and try his hand in Ireland. And the king only comes over and sets up in Ireland in 1172 because he's fearful that Strongbow will set up for himself. And then things like in 1460, that law is passed only because Richard, Duke of York, has got nowhere else to go. He'd be in England if he had won that battle, but he doesn't. When the kingdom is set up in 1542, a lot of it is local officials in Dublin who end up setting up that and who push that idea. The same in the early 1600s. That's probably a little bit more planned, but thereafter, after that point, I think it's very little. So whilst the kind of sociologists amongst us, or those of us influenced by ideas around sort of things like sociology, will always push to the big trends, and this is obviously all part of a sort of an easily identifiable sort of series. I think maybe the older school historians might like to always pick out the elements of historical accident, which suggests that there's never a big plan or never a big sort of a way to follow these sort of matters. And so we end up then in the 20th century, when most of the island separated from the UK after 1921, setting up initially the Irish Free State and later on the Republic of Ireland, or Ireland is the official constitutional name for the entity. They do so at a time when Ireland is free of many of those sort of colonial type discriminations that the law had offered in previous centuries. Religious issues are mostly solved. The state isn't really persecuting people on the basis of the religion the way it might have done before. Land has mostly transferred into kind of peasant or middle farmer ownership. So the idea of big English landlords living in London and sucking all the wealth out of the country is mostly gone by this point. A lot of the traditional issues of complaint for the people of Ireland are starting to disappear. And most interestingly, perhaps, despite culturally romantic 19th century aspirations of recreating an old Ireland or going back to the way things were, the cult of the peasant and all this sort of thing, Ireland, the Irish legal system remains almost identical to the UK system under which it has existed for many centuries. It's essentially a story of continuity. There's no real revolution in the Irish Revolution of the early 20th century. It's a very conservative revolution, even socially, the way it treats women, the way it treats prisoners, the way it treats people in health institutions is very conservative. And in some ways, it's even almost a backward step. And the law, we see no massive change. In some ways, in some cases, like I remember somebody telling me that the prison book used in the prison, the big ledger, they don't even start a new book. They literally just draw a line. And then the next day, the Irish Free State is set up and the prison is run in exactly the same way. And most of the courts are as well. There's no drastic change to the law. And then finally, in our post-Brexit Europe that we find ourselves in, Ireland is now the sole country with the common law system, which is in itself very, very interesting. So I think I'll just wrap it up there. Uh, and I'm happy to take questions if any of you are still here. I suspect I've gone on maybe a bit longer than I might have originally intended to.
Thank you very much, Coleman, for a very interesting lecture. I think it was very valuable, even if you overstepped your plan, because we really don't learn anything about Irish legal history in our system. So I'm sure many people have been enriched by this experience. So I'm opening up the discussion now. Please raise your hands or just turn on your cameras and microphones and speak up. Or if you can't speak up, type your questions in the chat. If anyone is feeling uncomfortable with their English, feel free to ask in Serbian and I'll translate. while people are thinking, I just have a few remarks about what you've asked or wondered about in the beginning about any parallels between Irish and Serbian history and so on. I do see some similarities. For example, the way you describe the Irish legal system before the uh, English came is rather similar to not just Serbian, but generally to the Slavic laws and maybe a bit to the Germanic laws. So no harsh criminal law system, mostly compensation and so on. Those things are similar. And
Right.
the example with the pulling of beards that you put that's very interesting, and maybe if you could tell us something a bit more about that when John pulled someone's beard, because I also noticed that in Eastern Europe, in Slavic laws, in Byzantium, that a beard is very important as a symbol of male dignity. And for example, in medieval Serbia, pulling on someone's beard is a rather severe crime because it's a severe insult to that man's dignity. And it's generally considered that Western Europe is different, that they are cleanly shaven and so on. So this was very interesting. Could you expand upon the beard issue, please?
Yeah. It's so if I remember the episode correctly, it's King John who arrives over to examine his kingdom and to essentially try and make something of himself, and he spends some time in Ireland. And yeah, the traditional kind of impression we get of the Anglo-Normans is that they if they do have beards, that they will be quite neatly kept. And so the Irish population is the Irish kings are more likely to have, we think, more considerable beards. So he's, I don't know if he's impressed or he's exoticizing it or whatever, but he does pull on them, and it's seen as being quite offensive, you know, because a lot of the time the Irish territorial leaders, we use the word king, but I think it's best to use it as a sort of a petty kingdom, or some historians have suggested we start using a word like count or earl almost, because they have a territory that would be sort of similar to about the size of a county, but they are kind of in many respects sovereign within their own small territory. They're quite offended because they will see themselves in many respects almost as being, for some people at least, will see themselves as being equal, and that this young man with not much experience and certainly very little manners would behave in such in such a sort of undiplomatic fashion. It creates quite a stir. The episode has been remembered because of that, you know. What it says, we probably need a sort of a socio-cultural historian to get more under the skin of beard history and its in all that it can offer. But there will be very interesting things, you know, because it's the same with history of hair and stuff like that, you know, in the same way that today, if people who will, you know, if you go to countries where such things matter, you know, where people will wear their hair or their beards very differently. For instance, in some Muslim countries where it's an essential part of your identity, your kind of religious ethnic identity. A lot of conservative Jewish people, you know, will have wear sort of fashion and hair, and to insult people on the basis of that would be a massive insult, not just to the individual, but also to their religious or ethnic group generally. So it could be that it's seen in that sort of a fashion for Ireland as well. I'm not really sure. I'm not an absolute expert in the period, so I wouldn't want to go further than that to make any sort of very strong statements about the issue. But it garnered enough attention to be recorded, so I think it must have created some impact or impression at least.
Thank you very much. Alistair has a question, it seems, and then Professor Simic. Just turn your microphone on, please.
That would help, wouldn't it? Sorry. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll start with one because I don't want to hog the the session. I noticed that the March Law example which you gave us was from 1545. This is the one where the female judge was sitting. This is only 3 years after the kingdom was created in 1542.
Yeah.
Did the creation of the kingdom alter the dynamics in March Law, because Ireland was officially, or more officially, closer to England, and therefore did that affect how the March courts dealt with issues?
It's a very interesting question, because, like you suggest, once you create the kingdom, like you say, just a few years previous, you're essentially creating a borderless, at least in theory, a borderless island, because everybody is now under the protection of the monarch. In reality, de facto, that's not the case. We still see that, despite, a law is just writing on a piece of paper if there's no enforcement, So at that point, I think that area is not too far from towns of considerable English populations. Kilkenny is, I for the area that I believe it's in, if I've got my map reading right, you could walk it in less than a day. You can drive it in a half an hour. So it's not too far from Kilkenny City, which is a proper Anglo-Norman city and has got a strong English heritage. But obviously the King's Writ doesn't extend that far, because in theory, with the creation of the kingdom, or even before that point, legally these March courts, I'm not sure how you'd see them from an English law perspective. They're kind of what happens when you need them to happen, because you need some sort of justice and some sort of arbitration to stop violence breaking out when there's disagreements.
So it's a bit like the continuity and change stuff that you were talking about, that sometimes change happens, but on the ground things carry on because they have to. Regardless, almost, with what big law is about.
Right, exactly. There is one thing actually that I would say, predict myself actually, is that in the early 17th century, the Court of Chancery, which isn't a common law court, it's equity, has an issue that comes before it. And now it's not the example that I gave, but it was an agreement, a Brehon law judgment, and an agreement made under what essentially is a non-existent legal system, and certainly one that's not recognized by English courts, but they will recognize it as good in contract, an agreement made that had been arbitrated by Brehon judges. So they're giving it a sort of a form of acknowledgement, saying that this counts as an agreement. We're going to see this as good in contract law, even though we're not recognizing the system generally. And we still think it's barbaric, by the way, which it always is, because you really need to emphasize that. But in actual fact, when it comes to a problem solving on the ground, they'll say, okay, we'll look at where do we go if we don't acknowledge it? Because it is a form of an agreement. It's just done under a system that we're not entirely comfortable with,
Okay.
I think something like that, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Now, we had a question from Professor Simic from Ljubljana.
Good evening, everybody. Professor Dennehy, I come from Slovenia, and I must say that there are many similarities in our narrative. We are both complaining, but you had it a little bit better than we had. But my two questions are these. When you mentioned the situation before Poyning's laws, you used an expression co-equal kingdom. Would that be something like personal union? And the other question is, you mentioned Irish Parliament existing almost all the time, and does that correspond to provincial estate in France or in Germany? Would that?
Oh, okay. So two questions. On the first one, if I understood it correctly, the term that I used was, yes, co-equal kingdom to as a way to sort of identify what the relationship might have been between the Irish Parliament and the state, but also the constitutional status between Ireland and England, and maybe even the relationship, a kind of a triangular relationship between the Irish Parliament, the English Parliament, and the monarch. How would we explain it? Is I suppose this would never have, the terminology wasn't used at the time, and I'm not sure that anybody would have been trying to push the matter too hard, but essentially in kind of representing the idea that Irish constitutional status might have been in the minds of some people at least, and maybe in the minds of some Irish historians of the past who wanted to believe it, that might have had an exact equal status to that of England, being essentially that the monarch is in effect the parent, and that the two kids are equally loved by the parent, and that there's not one dominant bullying the other one down, and that Poynings law, in restricting the independence of movement by the Irish Parliament, sort of does away with that system. Whether Ireland is ever really a co-equal kingdom, I think realistically, for the most part, I'd struggle to see how it could be, simply because England is much bigger, it's much wealthier, it's got far more influence, and from 1399 until 1689, there's no king of Ireland ever in Ireland. They're almost always going to be in London. Sometimes they might be in France or fighting in Scotland or something, but they never come to visit Ireland. It's very low on their list of priorities. If you saw that map where I showed how the Irish colony had shrunk in the 1300s after the Scottish invasions and after the Black Death, this is at a time when England is pouring huge resources into a war with France, and when they have lots of territory on the western side of France. But so whilst they're expanding in France, if they even put 10% of that wealth into Ireland, they could have taken the island very easily. But it seems to me it's just not that important. It's not very high on their list of priorities. The only reason why it comes about eventually is probably because they're scared that the Spaniards are going to land in Ireland in the late 1500s, as they do in 1602. And that Ireland only ever becomes a priority when it becomes such a problem that it can't be ignored. So the idea that an English monarch is ever going to give Ireland the exact same recognition and attention that it would give to its English possession, I think is impossible. If an old supervisor, a book by Ronald Hutton, for example, Charles II, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, I think he's making a very marked point that that's exactly the way, he says so in the preface, that the King of England sees his priorities, and Ireland will always come down the line. So I use the word co-equal more as a sort of I suppose almost as a sort of almost an aspirational thought behind how it could have been viewed, and particularly that 1460 period up to 1495, where there are historians in the past who used a term like aristocratic home rule, who kind of probably are reading a little bit too much into it, I think, as to what it could be. I think in reality, Ireland could never hope to have been in the time to be treated exactly equally as England would be treated. But at least in terms of constitutional status, there is an attempt to throw a little bit of light onto that idea that Ireland shouldn't be kind of always coming in a secondary position to England, particularly to its parliament, because the English parliament isn't where sovereignty lies in the period. It's very much with the king. But in reality, the English parliament will always be treated better than the Irish one, I think, if that answers the question. The second question was on I'm sorry, I'm after forgetting exactly what the second question was. I wrote down the first one, but not the second one. Could you repeat the second part?
Yeah, Irish Parliament, does it have a position similar to provincial estates in Central Europe or in France. I'm sorry, I stopped my video because I was censored by the system. It says my connection is bad, so I'll
Okay.
stop my video again.
No, that's no problem. I can hear you loud and clear. So the question was, does the Irish Parliament hold a position similar to provincial estates in places like France? I would say, I mean, I'm not an expert on the European provincial estates, but for as much as I do know about them, I think it's a useful comparison in some ways because of the inferior position of the Irish Parliament and of the Irish state, be that the lordship or the kingdom, generally speaking. At the same time, though, I think the Irish position maybe is I would say probably greater than that of a provincial estate in the sense that some of the French ones are like Languedoc or down around Toulouse or somewhere like that, in that Ireland's one has is integrated within a full national system of courts, and it's making legislation that would cover the whole island, and I think it takes it compares itself favorably as an equivalent, even though in reality, like I say, it doesn't always come across, but it sees itself as an equivalent of Westminster in many respects, whereas I think the provincial estates of France or of Germany would not see themselves as equivalents of the Estates General or the Reichstag, for as much as I know of them. Do you know that they're not, that they're very much provincial assembly? Now, in some ways, Ireland is, Irish people would kill me for saying this, but Irish can be seen sometimes as a province, if you like, of a greater sort of a British sort of super state. Alistair, I doubt you'd agree with that from a Scottish perspective, but Ireland's status is very different to that of Scotland. But in reality, it is sometimes being treated as very much as just an afterthought and very much as the colony, and that status is reduced, and we see that in behaviour for whatever we might make of bold constitutional statements or documents about legislative independence or whatever else. That can be stamped down very quickly, and we see that by someone like Cromwell when he comes to town in the 1650s. They just do away with the Irish Parliament, you know, because they're very powerful people. The English state is so powerful at that time that they don't need to recognise the importance of the Irish Assembly or the Irish state. And so in regards to that event, maybe it does make more sense to see Ireland within that. But I think the Irish Parliament in itself, the way it speaks of itself, would not consider itself to be a sort of a regional kind of a parlement as opposed to a national kind of entity. Did you want to come in there, Alistair?
I just wanted to say, I was going to say, it depends on how the contemporaries in whatever century they are felt about their parliament. Quite clearly, you look at the correspondence in provincial estates, you can see that they are behaving provincially, right? They believe that that's what they are. Yeah. If the Irish parliamentarians believe that they are separate enough to have a constitutional and parliamentary experience, which makes them feel independent to an extent, then it's more than a province. Yeah. So that's it's how the MPs feel at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the final thing that I would say on this matter is that when the colony is very small, the area of territory that's actually being affected by laws or statutes or promulgations that they're making is tiny. So the area covered by the Parlement of Languedoc, for instance, would be, in terms of square mile, square kilometre, would be huge compared to the small Pale of Ireland at the low point of the English colony, which is no more than the greater Dublin area now. Most of the Dublin metro buses and trains cover that area covered by the old Pale. It's just an enlarged city in many respects by modern standards, you know. So in terms of the territory that they're covering, the Irish Parliament maybe rates itself far too highly, and maybe a comparison is useful, you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? We had a raised hand there, but then that person logged out. We have a question from Livia's Edmina now.
Hi, everybody. Trying to start my video. Yes. Good evening and thank you. I must be honest, I missed the beginning, but very interesting lecture. So, based on this last remark, around at the beginning of the 20th century, there have been no commemorations as they have for the past 5 years on the centenaries in any legal sense. So no commemorations of any legal changes.
Yes and no, I would say. So in Ireland, I don't know if you found the same with creations of states in the Balkans in the aftermath of the First World War. We've had what I've sometimes termed a feeding frenzy of commemoration. To my mind, far too much. Look, commemoration is about politics today. It's never about a genuine concern about the past. Now, I can understand why political parties or states generally feel the need to do it, because if they don't take control of the commemorative activity, sometimes individuals or parties may do, and they then control the narrative about how we speak of the past. So I understand why it happens, but there are times where I think, do we really need another book or conference about the establishment of Ireland in 1921, because we've just had 100 published? Wouldn't it be great if we actually funnel some of that money into medieval history, early modern history, whatever else? That aside, my rant is over. As far as commemoration of the law goes, well, we've had a few things. We made a bit of a fuss of the first women coming into Parliament, and the first person elected to the UK Parliament, although she didn't take her seat, was a lady called Countess Markiewicz, who's married to a Polish guy. That's where the name is. It's not a very typical Irish name, as you can imagine. And it, in some ways, I always think it doesn't say a huge amount about her Republican credentials that she's always known by an aristocratic title, which may not even be a genuine title, I might add, because people looked into the history of the name. They're like, oh, I'm not sure if he's genuinely noble. Anyway, that aside, she's an interesting character. A lot of Irish people claim she's the first government minister as well, because she holds portfolio in 1919. But I think there's a Russian lady, I can't remember her name just off the top of my head.
Alexander Kollontai.
Kollontai, that's it, who does hold portfolio, I think, a year beforehand. But that's impressive. As far as the law goes, we have the British Legal History Conference, which was due to be held was this summer, which has been put off for a year because of the pandemic. They will be holding a legal history conference with a general title around constitutions and law or something like that. But it's a big conference, and it's held to commemorate the establishment of Northern Ireland in Queen's Belfast. So there'll be certainly there will be people talking about that. We had a few in the Irish Legal History Society, of which I'm a member and a councillor. We have had a few talks, but there's been no big government-sponsored kind of discussion that I can think of specifically around commemoration and the law, because, like I say, not a huge amount actually changes to the law. A lot of the same barristers are pleading. As far as judges go, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that a lot of the same judges stayed, because you need that expertise. You know a lot about how a lot of the police stay on. A lot of the British Army guys end up in Ireland. You know, because Irish people had been in the police, Irish people had been in the British Army, and you need the expertise, you need the experience, you know. I'm just thinking on my feet now about commemoration of law events. We certainly have had some, but the law, it doesn't appear to be in the big state funded, you know, huge events are mostly around the 1916 Rising, which is a military short-lived event, and then the events around the actual coming of independence in 1921, the treaty, stuff like that. The hard stuff comes in the next 2 years, because we have to deal with the Irish Civil War, which kind of party split, and I don't know if people want to deal with it, but not around the establishments of courts or anything like that. Not that I can think of, at least. So for the most part, they've steered clear. A couple of individual talks which have been quite interesting and quite good, but for the most part, the law isn't. I don't think it's featuring heavily, at least. But then, like I said, because nothing much happens, if there's nothing to commemorate, why would you? Do you know? There's something great about not doing commemoration stuff in some ways. I know that, and look, it's great in a way. The government has a huge amount of money at projects, and that's great. People have got postdocs, graduate students have got some income out of it, so we can't complain about that. And we've done. I was at a conference in Scotland in 2007, which was a commission organised event. John did it at St Andrews and Edinburgh, and we had a great time at that. And so I can't get too upset about it. But sometimes when we allow the politicians or the sort of our cultural leaders today to tell historians, you need to spend your time working on this. Surely as historians, we need to keep control over our own agendas. I think it's dangerous when you let the politicians decide what needs to be done. But at the same time, if they're giving us a big lot of money, why wouldn't you take it? So it's a little bit of both. Like I am conscious that we do have a responsibility to fulfill a role as public historians, and if we don't take the initiative and control that dialogue, people who don't know as much about the past and won't treat it as reverently and don't fully understand the responsibilities of giving a balanced, fair, accurate representation of what it's all about. If those people take control of the dialogue, then we end up with bad history. So maybe it's best to just kind of grin and bear it and get on with it, But just sometimes there are frustrations around commemoration. I don't know. Do you feel the same? What's the situation in I presume you're in Serbia at the moment.
Yes, I am.
Is there much of a conversation about?
I've got to be honest. I haven't followed this side of the conversation so much. I kept thinking back. I have been to one or two commemorations in 2016. Basically, any decent university had, with an Irish history department, or even with any sort of Irish history interest, had a commemoration and a conference. And I think I met the Irish ambassador in Hungary something like 2-3 times, which is ridiculous. But yeah.
Okay, that's
Thank
interesting. No, because it's interesting because our diplomats are frequently history graduates, so they tend to be quite good at going along to history events and things. So it's good to hear that they're. I know it's their job to do that anyway, but they seem to be genuine from what I can. Our ambassador in America at the moment is a big history fan. He has an MA and a BA from Cork, and he was at London before, and he came and he did an event with me when I was working there, which is really, and he brings us, like, a number of times we've held events in London, and he's invited us to the embassy and free food and drink and all the rest of it, which is, it's great to feel loved actually as a historian, because sometimes the state isn't always that interested, but the ambassadors in Ireland seem to be are really supportive.
The ambassador at the time in 2016 in Budapest was also a historian, so yes, it was very much sort of, you could feel it that he was interested and supportive of all sorts of commemorative conferences.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Alistair has one more question, it seems.
I do, yes. My second question. I don't want to bore everybody by, sorry, I have a sore throat. I don't want to bore everybody by comparing Scotland and Ireland, because we do that to death, don't we? Though when you mentioned Americans and the War of Independence there, it did occur to me that whereas Ireland has provided Biden, Scotland has provided Trump, but I won't go there, but never mind. But the different legal codes, I think, is interesting. One of the arguments when the UK joined the European Union in 1973 was that Scotland is well placed because it has a codified legal system where for hundreds of years, Scots lawyers have trained in Holland, not in England. And therefore, that kind of attitude towards law was there. And I wonder if you have any idea whether in 1973, Irish lawyers were panicking because they had a different legal system. They had a common law system. And I can imagine them being nervous at legal conferences compared with the Scots, who would have felt, this is great. It's exactly what we're used to. I don't know. And then you were talking about Brexit and all the rest of it, and the 2007 tidy up. And I was wondering if there is a continuing problem in the modern period for Irish lawyers with the fact that their legal code is different from everybody else, apart from England.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. A modern question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not entirely qualified to answer as regards to whether when we were going into what was the EEC at the time in 70s, we went in this, we were always going to go in the same time as England because the economy was so closely related, a little less.
Sure.
I don't know, to be quite honest with you, whether there was much fear of it. I think probably they would have been following kind of the English lead at that time anyway. How it's working out now for them, I don't know. I think generally speaking, Irish practitioners see an opportunity. They tend to, I don't think they're scared. I think people will be quite proud when they go and represent. I mean, we had we obviously we have a quote of judges and advocates who go over there. Usually we'll send over, you know, the kind of best and brightest as much for their ability, but also a status about being kind of good Europeans and putting our best foot forward and all that sort of thing. How it's working out now at the moment, I'm not sure. I mean, Ireland's not exclusively a common law system because we have so much European law which is influencing us, you know, in greater amounts all the time. Do you know what? I'm going to have to chicken out on that question and say I'm not entirely.
I was trying to get you to say that as the elections have been taking place in Scotland today. See, I've been trying to get you to say that actually, you know, Scotland that voted to remain in the European Union, not to leave, and that may well be that the success of Ireland staying in spite of its legal code, will be a great attraction to Scots, perhaps if they want to re-enter the European Union in the future. And we can therefore have conferences about when we weren't in the European Union, as opposed to as a kind of hiatus, if you like, when we go back in. You see? So it's sorry, I'm teasing you, Coleman. I was trying to provoke you into a confusing Irishman's answer to a daft question. That's all. It's fine.
No, it's a fair point. It's a very interesting question, as you say. I don't know. I'd have to bow to other people who know far more about it, to be honest.
That's fine.
And I'm sure there's an official answer, and then, you know, if you can get the practitioners aside and sort of apply a few drinks to them, you might get a very different answer again, you know. Officially, it's not a problem, you know, things work out.
Well, you wonder, don't you, whether Brexit is going to be good for lawyers or bad for lawyers. I suspect it's going to be good for lawyers. Because they'll spend so many hours, you know, trying to set up new agreements and goodness knows what. It's
Well, we've seen an
influx for lawyers.
Well, we've seen an influx of English trained lawyers registering for the bar in Ireland since Brexit. So I don't know if it might be that they need to be registered and qualified and, you know, have their papers to work on lot of multinational stuff or European law. So I think a lot of people are just hedging their bets and registering with the Irish bar as a
They
result.
want an Irish passport, I would think.
Basically, yeah, that's basically it.
Very good, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. If there are no more questions, then it remains to say thank you very much, Coleman, once again for giving a wonderful lecture. It has obviously inspired a nice discussion, and I could think of 5 more things to comment or to ask, but perhaps we've been here for 2 hours. Perhaps it would be time to let people, well, maybe not go home, but turn off their cameras and do something else. So thank you very much. We hope we'll have you live in Belgrade in a year or 2 as soon as the pandemic allows. And as for the forum members, next week we have a lecture in Serbian, so unfortunately we can't really invite you to listen, but we'll forward information when we have interesting lectures in English, and we'll be happy to have any of you here again.
Of course, and thank you very much for inviting me along. It's a real privilege to be invited to speak, and for sticking with me for what was obviously a lot longer than a 45-minute lecture that I promised. I usually don't do that in person. It's probably the comfort of being at home that happens. But thank you again. It's great. It's a great honor.
Thank
you very much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye, Nina. See ya.
Goodbye.